Good day, everyone. My name is Dean von Schoultz. I'm coming from the Nelson Mandela University in South Africa. Can you guys hear me all right? Okay. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about a personal informatics approach for academic and self-efficacy within our university. At the moment, we're looking at the approach, and this paper is really just looking at the dynamics of bringing this into our institution, and the initial problems we faced are mainly like technical issues, and really like ethical issues are a really big thing. So just an acknowledgement of my co-authors and supervisors, Professor Carolyn Thompson. She's on maternity leave at the moment, so she couldn't join us. And you may know Professor Johan van Niekerk. He's on his way to Norway, so he's immigrating, and he couldn't get his passport back in time, so he would have liked to be in here. All right, so I'd like to talk firstly a little bit about this idea of web use in higher education, and not having control over your web use. What kind of problems are there for us as individual learners, especially in higher education? You've got this balance between physical classroom lectures, and especially as IT students in our university, spending most of your time in laboratories, and naturally we're using internet for most things: communication, information, collaboration, all these things we're very aware of. And my initial research in looking at personalization was quite interesting, about how companies collecting your data, and they profile you very well, and they're very good at pulling your attention. So it really does take a good sense of diligence to be able to stay focused without the internet pulling you away from what you're trying to do, and I'm sure we can all attest to that. Someone who researches myself, I fall victim to it all the time. I really have to stop myself. So that's intrinsically a bit of a risk. I'm not going to spend, not so much emphasis on the idea of a risk, but just these things that could occur. And then a trend in some of the research that I've looked at when trying to profile web usage in academic setting, especially in higher education, is that the profiles of students who are very academically successful tend to be a lot different to others. Obviously, when you're looking at web use, there's incredible factors that you can't really, these findings aren't very generalizable, but this idea of web usage profiles being different in highly successful students seems to come up quite a lot. And Kimberly Young's work on internet addiction, I don't know if you've looked at it, but this idea of addiction to the internet, it's quite obscure in its definition, but if you just look at it objectively, the idea of being addicted to the internet, there's some disparity of what it really means, because you could be addicted to the internet itself, just having all this information. You could be addicted to something on the internet. So some people say that it's just internet gaming is actually something different to just being spending all your time online. And as a keynote speaker showed, it's quite an alarming amount of time that people spend online. So another interesting aspect of internet addiction was a study done where they looked at personality traits. What kind of personality traits were more susceptible to internet addiction? And the one that negatively correlated was conscientiousness. And Andreas, on his talk on Monday, was looking at personality traits and how actually important it is. So anyways, this idea of conscientious people being less likely to be addicted or negatively impacted by the internet is quite interesting. And this speaks a little bit about to what I've kind of, not conclude, but this idea that you really need control. And that comes from a personal aspect. So the Council of Higher Education in South Africa really recognizes, and in this quote they say, the recognition of this need to create this self-control. In this quote, it's saying, web browsers are trawl through millions of sites in seconds, and online video sites that make information available on any topic at any time. The challenge is really not how to present information to students, but help them navigate and help them really have these self-control skills. And this conference, it keeps coming through. So it's a pleasure to be around people who are thinking in the same wavelength. So the interesting problem that we're having in South Africa, our education paradigm is maybe not unique, but it's very different to a lot of countries. And we're experiencing a deficit in cognitive skills. And the reason for this or what seems to be apparent is this is attributed to the quantitative targets that education department is putting on our primary schools and high schools. You know, they really say we need these numbers. You know, we need to show that there's progress. And what happens is a lot of this, you know, especially in South Africa, a lot of our high school students and primary, not students, our high schools and primary schools are horribly underfunded. And what happens, you know, the result of this is they get educated with an emphasis on just how to pass exams. And their cognitive skills are really neglected. And so that trickles, it doesn't really trickle, but it kind of moves up into higher education because those skills are critical. So a lot of our students entering first year, they really struggle to manage their own learning, assimilate their own knowledge, and solve problems. And you really need these skills in higher education. So, I mean, this is compounded by the web. You know, you need that control. So anyways, move on. So at our university, around 50% of our students don't have mobile devices. The situations at home, it's actually really difficult to afford an ADSL or broadband line at home. And so most of their exposure to unlimited web access happens when they're first year students. Especially, like I say, this is what we found at our university. So, you know, perhaps a student is very conscientious, very diligent, they can manage their time online. Maybe for another student doesn't have those kind of self-evaluation, might fall into this trap of, you know, this spiral of spending too much time online and getting sucked into that and feeding off that, you know. So we're trying to really figure out a way to help them to create this control. Barry Zimmerman's definition of a self-regulated learner is one I really like, in that you're considered a self-regulated learner if you're metacognitively, behaviorally, and motivationally engaged in your own learning. And that very well describes, you know, a higher education student. They really have to be the proprietors of their own education. So if we're going to help our students, we really, you know, from an institutional perspective, we need to bolster this self-regulation, give them the tools they need to be able to be better at their self-awareness, because that's really, as we've seen with the previous talk, this idea of self-efficacy keeps coming up. And so that internal metacognition and control is really what we need to target if we're going to help them, because no one else really steps in. So we're really looking at the self-awareness aptitude is what we're going to look at. And if you start looking at how do we show a student their own behavior, it comes down to, you know, we need the data and we need to aggregate it in some way. And the field that kind of falls into is personal informatics, right? They have to be able to get an objective view of their behavior. Personal informatics is really about collecting and analyze your own information to do some tasks. Some people use it for fitness or for meditation practices, for computer use, these kind of things. And the one that really stands out for us, or I like this idea of self-knowledge through numbers, is time and productivity management. There are a lot of applications out there, if you go and have a look, like Rescue Time, Time Aware, these applications that monitor your computer use, aggregate it in some meaningful way, and you reflect on that and you make a change. And without that objective view of yourself, it's sometimes very difficult. You know, you need to see your own behavior. So these time and productivity management systems, some of them target web use, and they allow, especially if you look into one called Rescue Time, you can categorize your time on your computer or online as productive or unproductive, because productivity is very subjective. If you're spending time on YouTube, you might be doing some incredible learning. Otherwise, it might be completely distracting. So this is all happening at a personal level. And these time management, productivity, or productivity management in general, or even personal informatics applications in general, they target your self-regulation capacity and your self-efficacy. And this idea of self-evaluation is central to behavioral change, and this is why I think that they adopt this principle. Personal informatics really adopts that principle, because if you look into any learning or motivational behavioral psychology, a lot of it comes down to, you know, the first thing you need to do if you want to change your behavior is to observe your behavior. Without that, you don't really have a kind of a foundation for it. So there are a lot of interlacing theories, social cognitive theory, goal-setting theories. I'm not going to go into too much depth about that, but in general, we can look at a feedback loop that looks something like this, where you have some observation of yourself, you compare it to some standard or some ideal, and you will develop some goals towards that. And somewhere in between the motivation occurs, but I'm not going to spend too much time on that. So if we want to bring this kind of ideal into our university, or especially for web use, what do we need? We need to allow students to view their own web usage behavior. I mean, that's a no-brainer. But we'd also need to provide a standard. And our idea is to benchmark the web usage profiles of successful and unsuccessful students, and provide that as a benchmark. So they have some idea of, what should my web usage behavior look like? Or I think that initial assessment of yourself is very powerful, but you might need that standard. And this is what a lot of the psychology says about changing behavior. You need to have some standard, and you need to evaluate yourself. So the principal substance of personal informatics is obviously data. We need to have the data. So the first step in what we did a few studies previously, but the first real place to look at is, where does the data lie in our infrastructure? And the layout of our network subscribes to a proxy model. So all of the campuses of NMU, we have 6 campuses altogether. They all go through one device which controls the web usage and network traffic out to the web and back in. It's a secure model. A lot of institutions adopt this model. So what's great about that is all of that data has to go through one point. And we've looked at how to access that data and what does it look like. Because depending on the granularity of that of those logs, we would have to extract those web usage behaviors from that, and that's not an easy thing. So what we discovered was it's there. There is enough depth. So if we had to really extract the fundamental attributes of this data in order to make it useful for us, based on what we found in the literature for click. Well, you can call this network traffic data, or clickstream data is probably more acceptable. But these 5 underlined here are the ones that keep coming up as a prerequisite. Without these, you're going to really struggle to break down someone's web use. And our data at NMU has those attributes. We also got some additionally useful ones. Category, host name, and session ID. This really takes a lot of the burden of running some algorithms to find out what session are we referring to, and not having to extract the host names from the URL is also very, very helpful. So in my master's thesis, we looked at putting this in a data mart, and we found this data is very rich. So we can use it. We can definitely get some web usage profiles out of this data. So the data's there. And the next thing I'm just going to go back and speak about this a little bit. The academic data sits in an ITS system, so it's just a database for the academic data. So between this data and the web usage data, we should be able to do what we're trying to do. So if we had to overlay that feedback loop that we're trying to implement onto that infrastructure, we'll get something like this. So the network traffic data would have to be rerouted into some form of aggregation so that we can bring that data to the student in a meaningful way. I'll speak about the challenges in that a little bit later on the next slide. And so the general principle is that we will reroute that data so that it can be viewed in a meaningful way. We will couple the academic data to find the successful and unsuccessful student in our student sample, profile their web usage, and use that in the interface. So we're seeing the student's own behavior for comparison with a web usage profile of an academic successful student. So that brings me to the real message, or the, I don't know if you can kind of see that, but we've got these 4 areas which we think, and just from our previous usage, we know are going to be challenges. Some of them we already have an idea of how to deal with them, others we don't. That'll happen in future research, but I'll start with the technical ones. So This network traffic data, at the moment we have a retention policy of 2 weeks. So they only keep about 2 weeks worth of data at a time. If we want to bring this into place, we have to be able to collect all that data, store it, and reroute it in some meaningful way. And that might be an incredible process burden on the infrastructure. And we also are not sure at what point can we safely say that we've profiled a student's web usage. How long do we need? You know, is a month enough? Is 6 months enough? How much data do we really need to say we've profiled? This is what your web usage actually looks like. This is what your behavior looks like. So we need to define that criteria. Furthermore, this idea of successful and unsuccessful student, what we're concerned about is imposing a worldview on the students. If we say that this is what your web usage behavior should look like, how they interpret that might be, okay, well, that's our idea that we're kind of bringing to them. So we need to be very careful about that. And also, at what point can we say that a student is successful and unsuccessful? We can measure their marks, etc. But is it 80%? Is it 90%? Is it 75%? At what point? So that is something that we're still trying to work around. At this stage of the research, it's not as important. That'll come in a bit later. This forms part of my PhD, so I will discuss a little bit more if we have time how it all fits in. The next thing is, how do we aggregate this data in a meaningful way? There have been a couple studies who just broke down those time management applications and said, well, yeah, it's useful, but no one's really engaging in it, these kind of things. Something as simple as framing has been found to make a huge effect. If I frame this web usage positively, you might be less likely to respond to it than if I frame it negatively. A recent paper where they simulated the rescue time application. They said, if we frame it negatively, so you're very unproductive today. You spend all this time doing this and this and this, people are a lot more likely to respond. They actually change their behavior. If you're very positive and you said, oh, well, you've been 34% productive today, less likely. So there are all these, and this is fairly new. So we're still trying to figure out, there's a lot of nuances to this. So this is a big challenge. How do we actually make it useful? So, and then one of the largest ones is this issue of privacy. Your web usage is incredibly sensitive and private. In Europe, you have the GDPR, right? We've got the POPI Act, the Protection of Personal Information Act in South Africa. So we have to be very careful on how do we protect their privacy in this situation. So these are the real challenges in what we're trying to do. And I'm going to end off with, this seems to be what a man in our conference today, but this idea of creating self-directed learners, it's huge. And from our perspective, we're looking at higher education, but it all steps up from primary school and high school, and we're really experiencing that now in our university. And he recognized it. 2002, it's very recognized. But if you go read that paper, it's quite something. Coming from, I think, his initial proposal of the social cognitive theory, which is where this all comes from, in '86, if I remember correctly. So, yeah, that concludes what I'm going to, I brought across to you today. Any suggestions, ideas, or questions will be greatly appreciated. And yeah, that's it.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Matthew from Monash in Australia. In terms of the duration of the what's useful amount of data, 2 weeks is definitely not going to be enough. Yeah. If you think about the sort of the cycle of student behaviour over the course of a semester, at least as a unit, because in the beginning they have different behaviours, in the middle around assignments, just before exams. I'm sure you've probably looked at it, but your lecture recording system or your LMS access logs will show there's peaks and troughs that happen, on a weekly basis, on a daily basis, on a semester length basis, even before the semester and after the semester. So I would suggest you're going at least 6 months.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm actually very curious myself. Currently, we've got our ethical clearance is in the pipeline. They're looking at it in July. And the protocol that we've put into place to make sure that it's all anonymized, that we can't tie anything back to anyone. But we still need to know, we still need to break those students down, even though us as, the three of us who will look at it, by the time it gets to us, it'll be fully anonymized. But again, only until, and then once we've got some clarity and some protocols in place to actually start collecting the data and doing what we want to do, we will start hopefully kind of just after maybe 2 weeks into August. And that's when the students have all their progress reports back and we can identify them, we can start recruiting students via informed consent. And then we can start doing that profiling and gathering the data. So yeah, for sure, I'd say in my mind, I was looking at definitely a couple of months before we can get a real picture. And it'll be interesting to see, maybe after 3 months, if we compare it to what it looks like after 6 months.
Yeah, they'll mature in their behaviour. So after the first semester, they'll either learnt how to survive as a university student, or they'll have dropped out.
Exactly.
And then there'll be a maturity over the remaining, course of their degree or what have you. So hopefully there should be able to be a program. The other side of it is, I assume the students will know this is happening because this is Big Brother on steroids.
We have to recruit, we have to recruit a sample and then
right.
take it from there.
Because getting permission of the students to do this kind of stuff, at my university is they sign their life away at enrolment day. Because it's the only way you can legally start collecting all sorts of information that's useful to try and make interventions. But I also wanted to comment about, sorry, I'm monopolising this a bit, about the idea of the positive negative framing. Some students, as you suggest, will, I've been only, students will react differently to the same stimulus. So some students will be, they'll treat it as a kick in the pants to go and improve themselves. Others will treat it as, oh my God, I don't belong here. So it could be quite disparaging for them. So I don't have the answer as to how you do that, but I think there's a risk there. Some Australian projects in this idea of helping students to stay in university. They started looking at their web usage data and how often they logged onto the LMS and watched the lecture recordings and yada, yada, yada. What happened was they started then the student support centre started calling the students. Say, oh, hey, you haven't logged into Moodle for the last month. What's up? What's going on? Some students took that very positively, others took it very negatively, So even when there was a human in the loop, so I think we have to be really careful with this stuff.
Exactly right. The way we're kind of having to approach it is to say, well, you could really benefit from this, and you're going to have to be okay with this process. Even though we'll never see your data, it's got to really be something that they want. So I guess in a way that by getting informed consent, it's just a case of framing it correctly, because obviously any kind of idea of, oh, you're looking at my behavior, it's very tricky. So we're going to have to bring it in a way that we're really trying to help them, and that's going to be something that they can really. But again, it comes down to that self-discipline. It needs it. It's motivational. So it'll be tricky. It's not going to be easy.
Any other? I'll let her do it first, and then you. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you. This is a very interesting field. I was just well, I'm Jaana Holvikivi from Finland. So I was just wondering, have you checked what all data you can get from Google? Because at least they know that how much they have been in YouTube and watching what and where they have been and so on. So could they get some of the behavioral data just directly from Google, and you don't have to store it in your computers?
That's interesting. I never considered that. Admittedly, I think if we really want to, from an institutional perspective, do that kind of thing, I can just foresee there being problems with, we're going to run into maybe the same issues. At least if we're taking it from our own firewall traffic data, our own device, we can, I think our institution can be a lot more, a lot happier at being in control of those protocols and how we collect it. I never considered going, finding that data somewhere else, to be honest.
No, sorry, I didn't mean that you go to their data in Google.
Sorry, that's
but because they can see themselves. Because if this is a tool that they use themselves, so they can go to Google and check their own history. Yeah. And they see quite a lot through that. And then you don't have to use your resources for the whole thing. Okay. So I don't know exactly if it could be done, but at least I know that Google knows exactly in which restaurants I have been to and how many minutes I have watched each YouTube video and so on. That's what I meant.
It's a good point. We actually, the first paper I ever wrote was that talk by Eli Paris, who spoke about the filter bubble. And my first, what I did was created 2 Gmail accounts within the university, and we freshly dumped 2 computers so that there was no history. And we tried to figure out at what point does Google actually profile you correctly. How many searches does it take till they can actually change your search history? Because the idea is that they profile you and your search results change. They kind of track you. But what we found is we couldn't create that distinction between the 2 profiles, and we had radically different personas and different search engine keywords that we put in. So we thought perhaps because of that proxy, because of our network infrastructure, it impedes that somehow from Google. So I don't know if we didn't look any further into that, but it could be that within the network. There's some disruption in that. So, yeah, I will look into that for sure. Thank you for the suggestion.
We only have time for one last question.
I may have missed it at the beginning, but I wasn't sure about the range of subjects, faculties that the students are studying, because just to give you an example, at King's College, if you're in the law faculty, you use web resources to look at case history and so on, whereas if you're in the medical faculty, you have lots of online simulations which you have to engage with a group of students to debate what you analyse the problem to be, whereas if you're in engineering, then you do a lot of connections with measurement and control and so on, which is web, and then you also have lecture captions. So I think if this is your PhD, you need a whole chapter on what they're actually doing, because just recording their web use in terms of time, even if you do all the learning analytics, that doesn't tell you the whole story at all. So if you're trying to show the self-efficacy that results from self-directed learning, which is a very important study you're doing, you need to provide that information, because it varies. I mean, we had it's 10 years, we had a course on therapeutics, and I was the judge of it, and the students had all cases, and they had to then analyse those and work in groups. And when we broke it down, less than 5% of the students did all the work. The rest were just lurkers, but they were logged in online, but they didn't do anything. So in concluding the effective impact on self-efficacy, you need to know what those students individually are doing. Because you can have the web like we do, you do, I do, and you might be reflecting, and that's all part of learning, although you're not actually interacting with the machine. So you've got a lot of underpinning, I think. Well, maybe you're doing that already.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question, because we're using first-year IT students. In our School of ICT in our North Campus in NMU, all the first-year IT students do the same subjects. They branch off into networking, programming, and then end-user stuff. So our idea is that they should be on a fairly equal playing ground, even though they might be wanting to move on. But we thought that sample would be the right place to do it. Well, we need first-year students anyway, because that's kind of what our studies, what the concern is on first-year students coming freshly from high school. So absolutely, and what I'm struggling with a little bit is in my work is trying to keep it IT, because the behavioral psychology, educational psychology is so fascinating. So I have to keep bringing it back with emphasis on, so I have to focus more on the technical issues, the infrastructural understanding. And to measure that self-efficacy change, we have to do that in some qualitative way at the end of the day. But for now, we're just in this, what does it take to put it in place?